Sarah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I had to switch to my iPad because my computer is not working, but I think that gave everyone enough time to join our presentation. So with further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So at first we have Stephen Holland. He is actually the current Boston Beck chair, and he currently works at Lemessurier Consulting in the Building Envelope Consulting division. He actually graduated from Northeastern University, and he also has his professional engineering license. Similar, Luke, he also has his PE license, and he's been on the board of the Boston Beck Building Enclosure Council for as long as I can remember. So I think 3 to 4 years now, and has been actively involved. As I mentioned, he also has his PE license, and he currently works at SGH as a building envelope consultant and has worked on a plethora of different building envelope components and facades and types. So I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about that. And then lastly, we also have Ryan Ewell. He's been kind of bounced around a little bit. He has his background in architecture, and then he also now currently works in sales, supporting other architecture or building envelope consultant divisions, and giving us the best products that we can for the application that we would like to use it for. So to give a little bit of background about what this presentation is about and what our panelists will be talking about is bridging the gap between college and the workforce, and diving deep into how you can apply your degree in either construction management, architecture, or engineering, and how that relates to building envelope science, but also the different avenues such as architecture or consulting or even construction. So without further ado, I would like to give Stephen the floor to introduce himself, and then we can go through a couple rounds of questions. But if you have any questions during the presentation, you can either type them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them freely.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned earlier, my name is Steve Holland. I'm a building enclosure consultant and a licensed professional engineer. As a consultant, I mainly advise architects and building owners on how to best construct, design, or maybe restore their building enclosures, windows, facades, roofs, everything of that nature. It's a profession I did not know existed all the way up until my senior year of college. So I'm just kind of very happy to learn about it and hopefully advise others about paths there are. So trekking a bit back in time, I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, and I naturally gravitated towards the maths and sciences. And so most of my teachers and counselors recommended I pursue engineering in school. And they also thought I kind of needed all the help I could get. On the bottom left-hand corner of the screen here is a picture of my senior project where me and another engineering-minded buddy tried to make a hot air balloon. And that's a picture of me jumping off the patio into the pond to save the flaming remnants of the Zeppelin from going into the crowd. So since then, it's all been better, which is good. Things have really improved since then. I went to Northeastern University where I studied civil engineering with a focus in structural engineering. And Northeastern was great because mainly the co-op program where I got the chance to do, 3 internships at different construction engineering companies and really learn more about the different avenues. The first one was with DN Tanks, which is a concrete water tank company. I realized that wasn't for me, but I learned a lot about, construction, how to talk to vendors, how to talk to contractors, the lingo, the jargon, all that good stuff. My second co-op was with Walker Parking Consultants, a firm that designs, structural, parking garages and restores them. Also wasn't for me, but that introduced me to site work, being able to leave the office, go out into the field and actually watch the construction happen, which is something I really learned that I liked a lot. And then my last internship was for a company, HNTB, which does a lot of roadway design. And that was my first real opportunity to do full-on structural engineering. And I didn't really like that particular niche. I found it was very repetitive and tedious and thought I wanted to do something a bit different. So after I got into my senior year, not really knowing what I wanted to do, I had an offer to interview for company SGH, which was hiring for their enclosure division as a building enclosure consultant. And I figured, okay, much like everything else, I can just do this for a little bit. And if I don't like it, I can just, jump ship and try something new. But I ended up really liking the work. It had a lot of the facets from previous positions I liked a lot of site work, getting to go out into the field, see the actual construction happen. Or you can go to an existing building and do, forensic work to figure out, why is it leaking? Why is it so drafty? Why is it uncomfortable in here by the windows? A lot of investigative work and a lot of education. You constantly have to learn about new products on the market. You need to know the history of, different waterproofings, installations, and other products that got to this point. And there's really a culture of constantly learning and building on what to kind of help just stay on top of everything as the market's constantly changing. After 5 years with SGH, I joined another firm, Measure Consultants, where I've really taken more of a focus in existing buildings and historical preservation. That's been a lot of fun for me. I'm sure a lot of you college students are starting to learn more about sustainability and the importance of reusing what we have, especially buildings. So it's really cool when we can take a building that is otherwise okay, and then replace the one part of it that might be failing, like the roof or the windows, and then be left with a new building, or the same building, but on a new performance that can still continue to go on and meet the criteria and the expectations of new occupants, instead of just tearing it down and building a new one. And then with historical preservation, I've gotten to work on some really cool churches, universities, historical landmarks, and help bring them back to their former glory. And as a history nerd like myself, I found it to be pretty enjoyable, and it's left me in kind of a good niche of work that I really enjoy doing. I'll leave that for now. There'll be more questions later, but I'll hand it off to Ryan, who can give his bio and a little introduction.
All right. Hey, thank you very much, Steve. So full disclosure, this is a little presentation I did for my alma mater, Pratt University, when they were asking people to come to some alumni event and talk about what we did since graduation. So we back up a little bit before that. When I was younger, I wanted to be a naturalist. I just thought I could walk around the woods and know, all the plants and rocks and animals, and that would somehow be a career. And then I discovered, as many people, their first introduction to architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright, specifically Falling Water. And I said, you know what, maybe all this fort building and treehouse building, maybe I could sort of make a career, because apparently some people have figured out how to make, the built environment and the natural environment, have some kind of cohesion and symbiosis. So I was like, maybe we could take that in a certain direction. So I was lucky enough to have a technical center affiliated with my high school. And I was able to take some foundational classes for mechanical engineering, architecture, that sort of thing, and realized that I was actually very, very much interested in that, not just from a design perspective, but from a technical perspective. So I ended up going to an art school, for architecture, Pratt University in Brooklyn, largely because I wanted to kind of steer my own way through the program. I knew that there's a lot of engineering that you can learn out there, but I wanted to learn sort of new ways of thinking about problems. Maybe some of the old solutions that are still relevant, and maybe some new materials and science that can inform how the practice can evolve. So this first slide here shows what happened when I got out of school, but prior to that, I too had sort of a mandatory paid internship type situation, and it was essentially the architectural equivalent of a temp agency. So, would have liked to have something a little better, but you don't always know how things are going to play out. So within a few weeks worth of going to burnt out buildings and surveying them and detailing stairs for projects which I would never understand beyond that, I was placed at a firm in Manhattan called BBGM, now merged with HOK. Was a fantastic sort of window into what the sort of larger world of architecture and design can be, and ended up working there full time in the summers, and even set up my schedule so I could work there every Friday through the school year for a few years. And they wanted me to stick around at graduation, but I wanted to complete the IDP, and to be honest, I wanted to buy property, and I'm not from a situation where buying property in Manhattan was feasible. So I went back to my home state of Vermont, and I worked for a small firm. Top right image there is Gossens Bachman Architects, GBA, and they were appealing to me because I knew I could work in all aspects of design, construction, and CA. at a small firm, that's easier to do. And also, I thought I could buy property in the neighborhood, which is the rest of these photographs here. So they were kind of at the intersection of sustainable design and multifamily affordable housing, which I thought was a very interesting sort of problem to tackle. Next slide, please. So I did that for a few years and it was great. And then I realized that there were a lot of things I was drawing on paper and telling other contractors to do, which maybe I didn't necessarily fully understand myself in terms of having actually done them. So I took a little reprieve, ran up into the woods, built a few buildings, et cetera, and really sort of put the screws to what I thought I might know. Next slide, please. So that was a really good time for me because I was able to, not only survive out in a relatively inhospitable climate of northern Vermont through several seasons, but also kind of realize that some of the less known and respected ideas about how to build buildings were maybe undervalued. And some of the things that we were often asking contractors to do, for instance, were maybe overly complicated. Next slide, please. The other thing I was trying to do was figure out some sort of a work-life balance, which I had not had before. So when I re-engaged the architectural community, I was able to spend more time with friends, family, even met my partner, because I found a new way to do it, which was connecting architects, contractors, and installers, by representing manufacturers. Next slide, please. So this to me was very interesting because I got to travel all around. I got to rebuild old connections with old friends, a lot of architecture buddies who were kind of scattered all over the world, and bring something of value to them and help them in their careers, while striking that balance between focusing on something in my industry that I can become an expert and have value at, but also being able to keep that sort of balance in my life, which I had been lacking previously. Next slide, please. So this is an old friend of mine from New York City who, one thing you'll notice, you don't need to look at my feet too long. Next slide, please. One thing is that when you're traveling around a lot of different places, you can't have homes everywhere. So, that person would let me stay at their place in New York City, and I was able to build up that market as well as the Boston market, which historically has been my focus. Eventually, I got a place in Boston because of the amount of work there. And you can see on the left a little library, a couple of samples. This was when I was really just sort of getting started. And I basically started a company for somebody else. They sold brick and block and metal stud and nothing too exciting, really. But I said, hey, let's get into ventilated facades and rain screens and all kinds of other cool materials and, see how we can help solve the question of what happens if you wrap your building in insulation. How do you cover it up and maintain best practice performance and durability and all that? So I kind of made a new home down in Boston. Next slide, please. And very quickly found myself working on a lot of the top buildings and with a lot of the top architects and designers and developers. Here on the left, you can see working with a good friend of mine, Eric Hollenberg over at Jacobs, trying to figure out, hey, what are the best ways to solve some problems, get you the design you want while working with real world sort of budget and materiality and installation details. On the right is a glass rain screen project being done over at Brown University. And it didn't take me long to realize, A, I really love what I'm doing. I really love focusing on just the building envelope. And B, this is something I can do on my own. I can start my own company and provide equal or ideally actually even better service to everybody that I'm working with. So next slide, please. At this point, I've participated in about $15 million worth of facade business, a wide variety of different clients, but largely colleges, universities, hospitals, a lot of government work, both at the local, state and federal level. Again, this is similar to what Steve said. This is a job that I did not know existed. When I was working in Manhattan, you'd have people come in and do lunch and learns and kind of pitch their stuff a little bit. But I didn't realize that behind that, if you want to be, technically savvy and provide a high level of support, this is actually a very rewarding career path. So that was something that I almost kind of stumbled into, years after working as an architect. Last slide, please. And so here we are today. Basically, I still run around a lot, but I'm mostly focused in the New England market. I have a dozen manufacturers that I work with that are all over the world. On the bottom right, I'm in the factory in Langley outside of Vancouver, British Columbia with Cascadia Windows, inspecting some stuff. One of my favorite things to do is visit factories. It's a great way to really understand what can and cannot be done and why. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan. That was great. I am going to introduce myself next. My name is Luke, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how I went from thinking I was going to be a structural engineer to being tricked into becoming an envelope consultant. So I grew up outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I ended up going to college in New Jersey at a school called Stevens Institute of Technology. I was a pretty good swimmer, which is how I found the school. That's bottom left photo of the swim team. Couldn't cut it the whole time there being a swimmer. There were a lot of good people on the team, so I ended up getting into triathlons and was able to do a couple of really cool races around the tri-state area because Stevens was right next to New York City. Going through high school and college, I always thought I was going to be a structural engineer. I was really drawn towards math and physics, and I was in high school, I was building, pasta bridges and towers, and I was like, oh, civil engineering, I'm going to be a structural engineer. This makes sense for me. I went through the co-op program at Stevens, and my last co-op was with a company called Thornton Tomasetti. Everyone should know that company name. And I got to spend a lot of time in Manhattan working on the Empire State Building. They were doing tons and tons of renovations in the building. I'd be going out on site, measuring connections, making sure existing conditions matched what was on the old Mylar drawings. So I really enjoyed being out in the field, investigating, modifying the buildings. But I wanted to be in the Boston area. And at the time when I was interning at Thornton Tomasetti, they did not have a large presence in the Boston area. That has changed. Whenever I was looking to move, they had, I think, 2 people up here. And I kind of wanted to be in a bigger office. So it's a funny story how I found the company I work at now. While I was a co-op, Thornton Tomasetti would send out these quarterly emails talking about how they were doing against their competitors. Whenever I saw that, I saw the list of competitors and I was like, oh, that's a shopping list of companies that do the type of work that TT does. And on that list was Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager, which is where I am now. It's where I've always been after college. I went up to interview at SGH and they heard that I liked doing investigations and field work. And they said, our building technology department, that's where you really want to be. And at the time I was like, well, I just want to be in New England. So if you give me a job, I'll take it. So at that point, I was tricked into becoming a building envelope consultant. I did not know what a building envelope consultant was. Whenever I joined SGH, I just thought it sounded really interesting, something different. So it was a lot of learning in the beginning. And I was thinking about this, the past couple of weeks on what really mattered whenever I joined SGH and how I got to where I am right now. And I started thinking I became experienced because I had experiences through this field. And I think that's one of the biggest ways to learn as an envelope consultant. This is a photo from my second day of work. I got to go up and review a copper gutter. So immediately I was thrown into the field. People were giving me references to review and learn. And I got to see some really cool things right from the start. Investigations were a great way for me to learn about things. Whenever you get into an investigation, you kind of have a pretty narrow focus on a certain topic that you get to learn a lot about. This particular one, a campus had a piece of glass break and they didn't know why. So I learned about all the different ways that glass could break. And then I got up in a lift and saw that a piece of metal was too close to their glass. It was a simple answer, but I learned about all the other ways glass could break while working on this one. Research experience. I never thought in college that I would want to go get like a PhD and write a paper or do any big research project, but through work, I got to do a few different research projects. And in doing that, I learned a lot about a very specific subject. On the top left, we were looking at different types of desiccant. So we would let the desiccant absorb water and then heat it to get it to release water. And the other photos are me breaking a couple different types of facade panels to understand their strength after putting them through some freeze thaw cycles. So it's pretty cool experiences. And then where I think I've gained most of my experience are through new design projects. That's just where I kind of landed in this career. I ended up working on a lot of new design, and I put an asterisk next to it because not all of these are new design. The two on the right were rehabs, but they're pretty important to me whenever I think back on my career so far. Each one of these images on the screen, whenever I think of a certain topic, I probably point to one of these five, because each one of these meant a lot to me, where it was the project where I was first exposed to a certain type of system where I got to learn a lot about on it. The one on the left, you would think it would be where I learned a lot about curtain wall, but it was actually where I learned a lot about below grade waterproofing and amenity space waterproofing. That building goes like 3 or 4 stories into the ground, did a lot of cool waterproofing work connected to other buildings. And then they had some pretty sweet amenity spaces on the top of it. The middle one on the top, learned a lot about glazing. Just for some reason, they had some issues with IGUs on that building. I got to learn a lot about that. The bottom one in the middle, it was a pretty cool curtain wall project. Learned a lot about curtain wall. The top right, they coated 100% of that building in an elastomeric coating. The first time I learned that you could do that, and it was pretty cool. And then the bottom right, I learned a lot about storefront and GFRC panels. So these projects happened early in my career, and I'm constantly going back to reference them. And I think that's one of the main ways that I kind of work and gain experience, is by remembering what I've done in the past and building on that in the future. So it's a little bit about me. I'm not sure if anybody has asked any questions in the chat, or Sarah, if you want to start the next phase of this presentation.
Yeah, it's a great segue, because we actually do have a question from Rachel. Just give me 1 second while I ask what her question was. So just curious, what was your favorite project and why? And I'm also going to elaborate on this out of my own curiosity. What was your favorite project, but also what was a project that you've been involved in where you realized what building envelope science was, aside from just architecture, design, or perhaps construction, that you realized, oh, this is a whole industry? So I guess that's 2 questions in one. Does anybody want to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Just because it's on the screen, the top right one, where it's just a coding project, it was fun for me, because that was kind of the first project I was let loose on, if you want to call it like that. I ran the whole thing, did the investigation, the design documents, and then I PM'd the rest of the project. And I probably like that one a lot because everything went well. There are plenty of them that don't go well, but that was a fun one. And then building science wise, the one in the top middle, they had some pretty interesting issues with the IGUs on that project. So we got into very specific temperature conditions, solar conditions that occurred whenever they saw this issue. So that was a pretty deep dive there.
Yeah, that seems like 2 really fun and different projects.
Yeah.
Steve, wait, you're muted.
I would chime in my favorite projects. Right now, I've had the opportunity to work on what I'd call a mega project, where a university is studying a lot of their buildings that are all built very similarly, but built over a 60-year span. So, I mean, you have about 20 or so buildings that were built every 5 years, starting in the 30s till modern day. And I've really gotten the opportunity to look at the old drawings and see how the way we build things has changed and the way we design things has changed. And then I can go to those buildings and look at how those changes affected their performance, which ones are failing quickly. When did we start making changes for the better? Did we make a change and decide that was not a good idea and go back and do something different? And that's been really cool too, because working for a large university, you can really get a full scope of the industry when you realize how much work, just maintenance wise, they have slated for things like roof repairs and seals, fixing brick. You can really get a whole idea of what an industry it is just by looking at the simple maintenance an institution needs to do.
Yeah, I think that's a really unique opportunity to work on a project that was incrementally built. I always love opening up really old masonry buildings because it's kind of like going into a time machine. You get to see how things were constructed 50, 60 years ago and what materials they were using and how they constructed it. So I feel like building envelope science, as you said, Luke, is constantly evolving, but you learn a lot from your previous experiences because some of your projects are really old buildings or some of them are new and they're a completely different animal. We do have another question, but Ryan, did you want to tell us about your favorite project or a project that really introduced you to the building envelope science world?
Sure. I'd be happy to talk about that. I think, so first off, I am not a structural engineer, but every now and then I have the right idea about how something needs to happen. And so, in that context, my favorite project that I've been involved in probably was the Department of Homeland Security headquarters in DC. Now, obviously, I can't, talk too much about the job, but what I can say is in my very first meeting with the architect, it was clear they had a very ambitious design, deeply profiled terracotta tiles, essentially dripping multiple stories over a glazed curtain wall. And, my first inclination was, not to promise something that couldn't be done, but to say, if we could do this, this is how we might be able to do it. Epoxy bonding multiple different extruded elements with core reinforcing out of steel or aluminum as needed. Where and how we would handle the gravity loads, essentially proposing, structural steel at every other floor plate to pick up the loads. And then acknowledging that we're going to need tiebacks for wind load intermittently in addition to that. And, that might sound simple, but at the end of the day, we explored quite a few different potential ways to get their design intent realized. And when it all came out at the end, that is actually what we did, was sort of my first thought approach in our initial meeting, is where all the engineering and everything else drove us at the end of the day. So I saw that as a bit of a small win that, even the local architecturally trained sales guy somehow can come up with the right idea. And I felt good because yes, we vetted a lot of options, but we didn't steer anyone in the wrong direction. We didn't waste a lot of time and energy. And at the end of the day, one of the perks of working with the government is they tend to get what they want. So they did, and it's a success story. So
sounds like a great project. And we have another question from Greta. So each of you mentioned gaining experiences and new knowledge as you worked on projects. Did you have mentors, or what were the other ways you were able to learn as you went along? Steve, I'm going to pick on you because you're the only one unmuted.
Sounds good. Mentors, definitely yes. I think at each of my internships and full-time jobs, whether it be my boss or project manager or just, peers, the industry is so collaborative and encourages so much conversation that everyone's talking about their projects. If someone has something that's tough on their project, they'll reach out and ask questions to the group. And there's a lot of opportunity to learn like that just by hearing what's going wrong on someone else's project or what's going really right on someone's project. And then there's also just a tremendous amount of information that is accessible online for free or in standards, ASTM standards, every single, niche material has their own standard, like concrete and steel and terracotta and copper. There really is a tremendous amount of material that you can just search for online if you know where to look. So I'd say it was a combination of, mentorship and just knowing where to look for the right information.
I agree. Mentorship was very key to my growth. And I think for any of you on the call that are in college or just new to the workforce, whenever you get your first job, I don't think that people expect you to know everything. You shouldn't think that way. You're not going to know a lot. And it's through mentorships and apprenticeships and just going to different presentations and learning. That's how you get somewhere in this field. So don't put a lot of pressure on yourselves to try to know everything when you first join a company. You're going to be learning forever.
I'm going to chime in. Oh,
No, go ahead.
Mike.
No, go ahead, Sarah.
I was going to say one of, I guess, my ways that I really integrated into the building envelope science was attending the Boston Building Enclosure Council. And, in a way, I feel like everyone on the board, we meet monthly, get pretty close relationships working together. And if I had, a question, I know that I have really intelligent colleagues that I can rely on. So it's, also the Building Enclosure Council isn't the only group out there. There's a lot, as if you want to get in specific for materials, but I think this one's pretty general as far as the science goes relating to the building and construction industry. So it's, and like Steve mentioned, our meetings are $10 or they're free, depending if you're a BSA member. So there's definitely virtual groups to join, and you build those relationships and use them when you need them. But also a lot of my mentorship came from my previous managers, and I continue to grow that relationship, even though I'm no longer with those different companies, and reach out to them along the way.
Thanks, Sarah. I think, mentorship is interesting. I haven't necessarily had one person who's, stuck with me throughout my whole career that I rely on, but I would see a mentor as anyone who keeps you passionate about what you're doing and doesn't drive you out of the industry. And from that perspective, I've had quite a few people that I've looked to over the years. I mean, in college, it was as simple as professors who had design that I respected and who managed to make time for teaching even when they were running their own practices or working at larger firms. I always respected that. And then, working for the larger firm there in Manhattan, I found that my sort of boss, if you will, would never hesitate to throw anything my way, and occasionally would then basically have me check my own work. And I realized, I was like, oh, this is actually how it works, isn't it? Thank you for not coddling me and really just throwing me into the fire. Occasionally, while I was still a junior, senior in college, they would even pull me into meetings with owners. One that comes to mind was the tallest building on the Vegas Strip at the time. And, I was not prepared to or intending to speak with the owner that day, but they thought I had something of value. And so that was very interesting to me. And then, so yeah, anyone who really has faith in you and gives you a chance to do your best, I think is really important. And then, funny enough, when I got into the manufacturer rep side of things, I found that really going straight to the source, the people that, do material science, that push the boundaries of what you can and cannot do with different materials and fabrication methods, they're really at the cutting edge. And terracotta and metal and GFRC and glass and all these different things, they're completely different. And the people that are pushing the boundaries with this stuff, they're truly passionate about what they do. And I found that to be fairly contagious, and get a lot of inspiration out of these people that are always trying to create new solutions to old problems, or sometimes even create new problems, so to speak. So.
So I have another question kind of playing on the topics that we've talked about as far as experience goes. Do anyone on the panel, or actually anyone in this meeting, have advice on how someone getting out of college, or perhaps you're still in college, would try out these different types of work? And what I mean by that is we have, consulting, I'm in construction, we have sales representatives, we have architects. What is a way for them to try out these different roles? Or kind of, cross that bridge, and like, how do they find these opportunities?
I would think internships and co-ops would be the first place to start, at least in the architectural community, consulting industry. Being a manufacturer's rep, I don't know if there's internships or co-ops available. I don't know if anyone can talk about that.
Yeah, Ryan, do you have any?
Yeah, like where would you start there?
Yeah, right. So I just stumbled into it, to be honest. I went to an interview at a firm that sold stuff that I wasn't really interested in. And within a few seconds, they said, hey, if you could do whatever you want here, what would you do? And I proposed starting a new company for them doing, much more sort of high-end stuff, engineered systems and whatnot. So I'm not sure that's going to happen every day, but it doesn't hurt to reach out and see what's available. I think the key is just finding out what you're interested in. And so, in today's world, whether that means, getting a temporary position at an architecture firm, at one point I was working for that firm in Vermont, and I was working 60, 70, 80 hours a week for way too long, because a classic thing with small firms is, you get the principals and the owners, involved in going out and generating new work. And then all of a sudden you have so much work that the principals, the owners, the people who are supposed to be getting new work end up pulled into the design process, and now they're actually engaged in those jobs, and then they don't have time to go find more work. So you get a bit of a sawtooth in terms of your workflow, where you're way too busy and then you're not busy enough. And this is a problem that a lot of smaller firms have, and occasionally larger ones. And so when you're busy, they're reluctant to hire because they know there might be another lean time coming. So I came in and I said, okay, so I can cut back my hours, or you can hire my buddy. And so what they did is they hired him for 3 months, 3 times in a row, because he was clearly performing. So I think that you don't have to be afraid of this huge, big commitment. Yes, of course, when you go to interview somewhere, they would love to think that you want to be there forever. But if you come in and you say, look, I'm willing to work with you for 3 months or for 6 months or whatever, and try it out. Yeah, that's often done through a work study or some sort of program affiliated with the school, but you can do that on your own. I mean, in today's world, there's a lot of flexibility about how you are going to approach employment, whether you're going to balance several small things, or whether you're going to be all in on one. And I don't think it's unreasonable to approach a company and say, hey, I'd like to give it a shot, see if I like it. And I know that there's a lot of people that would be open to picking up a little extra help, even for a relatively short period of time. And as we all know, that may turn into something much longer. So.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, Ryan. I never thought about, asking for short-term work, especially for those, that have graduated college and they're trying to, break into a different field, whatever that may be. I know that my company would appreciate short-term help, and I'm sure they're not the only one. So that's really great advice. Thanks. So we do have another question from Rachel. Could the speakers elaborate on the different roles they've had throughout their careers and how they've changed over time? So I guess, were you guys doing what you do now when you first started, and how has that changed?
Not really. So whenever I first started, I guess I would probably call myself like a field engineer whenever I started. I was being sent out in the field 2 or 3 days a week to do whatever was needed of me. Sometimes it was long-term projects, sometimes it was short-term. That was maybe like the first year or two. And then after that, maybe I would classify myself as like a pretend PM for a couple of my projects. I was running it, but there was a lot of heavy support behind me. To the client and owner, it looked like I was in charge, but really I had a whole group of people helping me out in the background. And then, probably after 4 or 5 years, transitioned more into a real like PM, running my own things, needing very little support, having people working under me. And I've been doing this for 8 or 9 years, and I'm in a pretty solid role as PMing some projects right now. So I guess it's a transition of responsibility is how I've seen my career change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Steve or Ryan, do you want to add?
My career path is actually very similar to Luke's in that regard. So I'm actually going to put it back on you, Sarah, because I know you had a pretty good kind of role change 4 to 5 years into your career.
Oh, thanks. Actually, so I guess a little bit about myself. So my background is similar to Steve's in the fact that I'm also a civil engineer, and same thing with Luke. And I got my job as a field engineer out in the field, building utility-sized solar farms. And then I was also reached out by this other company saying, hey, do you want to be a building envelope science technician? And I had no idea what building envelope science was. But after realizing my first year working on solar panels that I really wanted to be involved with buildings. So I was like, sure, I don't know what this is, but sign me up. And similar to the roles that you guys were describing, I would visit buildings, I would perform evaluations, I would do the design for repairs, and that's where I learned a lot about what building envelope is. And I was in that consulting role for about 4 years, and then I transitioned into the construction role where now I'm a quality control manager. Through how I navigated through those different career paths was I found what I liked and what I didn't like. And I really honed in on the concepts that I liked. For instance, my first job, I really loved construction, but I didn't like working in solar or heavy construction. I wanted to work with buildings. So then my next job, I was building envelope consultant, changing the world one building at a time, making them more energy efficient, repurposing them, which I really enjoyed. But I also realized that I had a love for being out in the field and being hands-on. So then in my next career path, which is at Consigli now, I'm constantly out in the field, but I'm also applying everything that I've learned back from consulting and also some of my courses. So really my background is quite different, but now I'm in a role that really ties it all together. So there's a lot of synergies between these different types of industries that you can play on your strengths. And like Luke said, find out what you like and keep following that. But also it's important to find out what you don't like. I think that's also equally important.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, over time, I mean, I think very much to Sarah's point, figuring out what you want to do ideally can have a lot of influence on how your career changes. I knew in college that I was really interested in sustainability and resiliency, and but then when I got out into the world as an architect, I realized there was an awful lot of stair detailing to be done, and egress to figure out, and precast panels to do shop drawings for. And yeah, that was all great experience. But when I made the move up to the smaller firm in Vermont, part of my hope was I could really bring back these ideals of sustainability and resiliency and focus on the building enclosure while doing so. And that was largely successful. But there comes a time where the problems are not exciting enough, the challenges are not new enough. And that's where, I wasn't quite sure where to go from there. And when I got into the, representation of manufacturers, really when I started my own company was when I realized, okay, here's my chance to really do exactly what I want, no more, no less. Because as an architect, you can be the envelope guy, but you're probably going to have to do some other stuff too. As a contractor, same thing. You don't always get to pick and choose exactly what you're going to do. I know plenty of glazing guys that get pulled into doing stuff that's not glazing. And I know plenty of guys who want to put up cladding and they have to do AVB and insulation too. So, I worked as a contractor for years as well during my sort of homesteading phase. And yeah, you kind of have to be flexible about what it is you're going to do. So when I started my own company, not as an architect, not as a contractor, but as a manufacturer's rep, I realized, okay, I can focus 100% on, sustainability, resiliency, building envelopes. And, granted, people are always going to pull you in different directions. So a lot of the manufacturers I work with, they have fantastic interior offerings. But I said, nope, not for me. Somebody else can help support that, because I just wanted to focus on what it is that I was passionate about. And, after doing this for about 10 years, I think that I'm there. So it took a while to get there, but I kind of brought it all together in the end.
Right. I think having that flexibility, especially starting your own business, is a courageous thing to do. So Coretta has a question. She said, which college courses have turned out to be the most the most helpful background for you in your work? I'll read that again. Which courses have turned out to be the most helpful background for you in your work?
I would say that for me, having taken a lot of structural engineering courses, but then not ultimately needing the very detailed ones. The first one or two I took, I think, is called statics, something to that effect, but like structural analysis 1, where they teach you just very high level. Here's how a general building structure works. Here are the general forces we think about. I find that those are the things I think about all the time, because those general overall principles apply to so many things. And I think materials too, because you learn a little bit about concrete, steel, all the things you interact with so often, that just the high level knowledge you find it applies to so many situations.
Yeah, I think I'm going to piggyback off you, Stephen, and say material science was one of the most, for me at the time, underrated classes, but the most useful, because now, since I deal a lot with chemistry and different sealants and compatibility, I dig deep into, okay, what does the word, where do these words come from, such as polymer, and then it relates back to the molecular structure, and here's why things don't agree with one another. So having that, I guess, base knowledge has really helped me years after I took that class.
Yeah, this is a tough one, because I think, it'd be easy to say that the architectural design studios were the most important, because they took up, far and beyond the most amount of your time for 5 years. But and it taught you how to think about, space and form and architectonics and program and things, and really change, your whole understanding of what buildings are and what they're for. But, additionally, I had some supportive classes, like planning. Planning was an early morning class. It was very easy to fall asleep, except for the information was so fascinating, because it takes and it scales up, and it makes you realize it's not just about any one building. It's about how all these buildings relate into a fabric, and how it influences the way people live and operate, on a much larger scale. And then, very specific sort of classes like ecology of sustainability and physics of sustainability. They may sound a little bit vague, but the very specific ideas and topics that were discussed during those classes were planting seeds for, considering how much room we have to improve as an industry. So those are definitely some of my favorites.
So do you have any more questions? So we don't have any more, but there is a good one that I'd like to leap off with. And I'm also would like to open the floor to anyone who would also like to answer this question. But what advice do you have to students who are deciding where their career path can take them? When, we've talked about for like the past hour to find out what you like and gravitate towards that. But what happens if you have, multiple options, or you don't really know where to start, or you don't necessarily have a mentor? What are some steps to at least start chipping away to help you make this decision?
I'll start. I don't know if I have a good answer to that, because it's really hard to figure out what you want to do. Personally, just looking at my experiences, I was able to have some work experiences before I graduated where I could say, no, no, no. And then eventually I started saying yes to some things. So if you still have time, go out and try a few things. But if you don't have time, you really gotta do some soul searching and think about what you kind of want to set yourself up for to accomplish at wherever you're going. And if it doesn't work out, don't stress out about it. You're still gaining valuable experience that you can take somewhere else. It's hard not to stress out about it, but whenever you look back, you'll think, oh, I learned a lot there and it's useful now. So.
Right, like my materials class.
Yeah.
Piggyback on that. I mean, internships, if you can get them, or short-term work, are the best way to figure if you don't like or not like something. But assuming that's infeasible, most people, if you reach out to them on LinkedIn and say, I'd really like to know more about what you do, can you talk for 30 minutes? Most people will say yes, just happy to chat, happy to spread, the industry knowledge. So if the internships aren't feasible, that's probably the next best option.
Yes, reverse interviews. I've done a few of those and they were really beneficial.
And then if you're interested in that profession, it's usually a good way to segue into, oh, does your company hiring, by the way? So double dip.
Yeah.
So I would say, in addition to the sort of obvious criteria of, work flexibility, schedule, pay, benefits, this sort of thing, consider sort of how many opportunities there are for networking available, not just within the position, but in terms of who engages that company. And what I mean by that is, maybe you find yourself working for an architect, but that architect is going to be working with structural engineers and consultants of all various kinds, building envelope consultants. You may even find yourself working with an owner or developer that you happen to hit it off with. And just keep in mind that everyone you talk to, and this is something that I was told in high school, actually, in one of my technical courses, everyone that you ever talk to is a potential employer. And, it's sometimes hard to think that way when you're working, with your nose to the grindstone as an architect, but there's no reason to say that you can't go and work for that developer or go work for that consultant. So, the more people that you're personally engaging with, and also that potential employer is engaging with, those are only opportunities for you and where your career may go in the future.
Yeah, it's a great perspective, Ryan. Greta, did you want something to share?
Sure. Let me lower my hand. Just briefly, I think people have mentioned flexibility. I think that's really important. But I also think it's kind of related to don't feel frozen in the first decision that you make and the place that you work. And I'm not a great example. Well, I did work for 13 years in architectural firms and I really liked it, but I felt like I wanted to become a specialist. I left architecture for quite a few years and became a full-time student in earth sciences and took a lot of science, graduate level chemistry, physics, and so forth, material science, and may or may not surprise you, but material science concepts are used by geologists to understand how rocks are deforming and so on and so forth. anyway, in order to earn money, teaching jobs were not plentiful. And so I went back to architectural firms and did CA and so forth. But I found that my approach to architecture was completely different because I was sort of fearless about the science, and I learned about building science along the way. And the last 20 years of my career, I just retired a year ago, were really the best years of my career. Because I had finally found that community. That's another thing actually about building science, is that it's really a neat community because we have manufacturers, contractors, consultants, engineers, architects, all trying to share information. And as Sarah said earlier, the Building Enclosure Council is one way that these conversations can continue. Anyway, that's a snapshot of my career, and there were big changes over time. But it all adds up to something that I really enjoyed.
Thanks, Greta. Well, I think that concludes our questions, but does anybody want to raise their hand or chime in? All right, well, I will leave it at that. Thank you, Luke, Steve, and Ryan for being on this panel today. I will end it that, as I mentioned before, for those of you who came in a bit late, we have the RAG-D&E Symposium next Wednesday or Thursday on October 6th. So if you haven't already registered, it's all on our website, so go and check it out. And then also the following, the last Monday of every month, we have another meeting. It's to be determined, but we're thinking about Building Science 101. So for those college students or anyone else who's somewhat new to the industry, wants to take a step back and learn a bit about the basics, please visit our website and also stay tuned. You can also follow us on our LinkedIn page for updates. And without any other announcements, I appreciate your time and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot,
thanks
Sarah.
everybody. Great panel tonight.
Thank you. Steve and Ryan, do you want to, or actually the Boston Beck, any of the chairs members, you are more than welcome to stay on and we can continue the conversation.
I'm going to be back in 5 minutes. Let me take a quick break.
Yes, we can do that.
We have a board
I got
meeting.
a quick question.
Yeah.
Your monthly meetings last Monday of the month, is that right?
No.
Yes.
Fourth.
Is it the third?
Fourth.
Fourth. Sorry, the fourth.
Except this month, it is the last month, Monday.
Right. Sometimes it ends that way and sometimes it doesn't. I've made that mistake.
Yeah, no, I was just curious for if we were going to be celebrating Halloween during the next meeting or not. So,
Oh, that's true.
I look forward to in-person meetings as soon as we can. But thanks again, everybody, and I'll talk to you all later.
Thank you, Ben, for coming.
See you, Ben.
All right,
Thanks.
all right. Bye, guys.
So we're taking a couple of minute break.
Yes, I need to blow my nose and grab some water. So we will reconvene. A moment. BRB. bring up the meeting minutes. Actually, Luke or Steven, do you mind sharing your screen? I'm on my iPad, so it's complicated. With the, I guess, agenda that I sent out with the meeting invite.
Let me find
You
it.
were working on it, Steve, or?
Yeah, I'm working on it.
All right.
But didn't the invite come from the BSA?
I think Sarah sent out agenda items, though. I remember looking at them. Maybe I'll raise
Okay,
it to
I
it.
can forward it. Yeah, I apologize. I was a bit scatterbrained today, and when I called the BSA to, oh, hold on. One of the co-hosts, can you stop the recording?